June 30th, 1908. Deep within the endless wilderness of Siberia, the day began like any other. The forests surrounding the Podkamennaya Tunguska River stretched for thousands of miles in every direction. There were no cities, no highways, no power lines, only dense taiga, scattered settlements, and vast, empty land untouched by modern civilization. Few people lived here, and even fewer outsiders ever visited. On that summer morning, hunters were preparing for another day in the forest. Reindeer herders moved across the landscape as they had for generations. The wilderness was quiet. Then, without warning, the sky changed. Witnesses later described seeing a brilliant object racing across the heavens. It was brighter than the sun. Some said it looked like a giant ball of fire. Others described it as a glowing, blue-white column moving at incredible speed. Across hundreds of miles, people stopped what they were doing and stared upward. The object continued its path across the Siberian sky. Then came the explosion. A blinding flash erupted above the forest. Moments later, an enormous shockwave slammed into the ground. The force was so powerful that people were thrown from their feet dozens of miles away. Windows shattered in distant towns. Buildings shook violently. Witnesses reported hearing sounds like artillery fire, thunder, and massive explosions rolling across the landscape. Some believed the end of the world had arrived. One local resident later recalled being lifted from his chair and thrown several feet by the blast. Others described feeling an intense wave of heat, as if their clothing might ignite. Animals panicked. Reindeer stampeded through the wilderness. Birds scattered into the sky. The explosion echoed across central Siberia. But the devastation was only beginning. At the center of the blast, millions of trees absorbed the full force of the shockwave. The forest simply collapsed. Towering pines and larches that had stood for decades were ripped from the ground. Entire hillsides were flattened. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Across an area larger than many major cities, the wilderness was destroyed in seconds. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend. By modern estimates, roughly 80 million trees were knocked down. The destruction covered more than 2,000 square kilometers. Yet despite the enormous power of the blast, very few people were killed. The reason was simple. This was one of the most remote places on Earth. Had the same event occurred above London, Paris, or New York, the consequences could have been catastrophic. But in 1908, the Siberian wilderness absorbed the impact. For days afterward, strange reports continued to emerge. People hundreds of miles away spoke of unusual lights in the sky. Others described glowing horizons long after sunset. Something extraordinary had happened over Siberia, yet nobody knew exactly what. Communication was slow. The Russian Empire was vast. The blast zone was isolated, and reaching the affected region would prove extremely difficult. As news slowly spread, stories became increasingly unbelievable. Some claimed a giant meteor had struck Earth. Others suggested a volcanic eruption. There were even rumors of a divine warning from the heavens, but nobody possessed evidence. No photographs existed of the explosion itself. No scientific instruments had recorded exactly what occurred. Only eyewitness accounts remained, and those accounts raised more questions than answers. What was the object seen streaking across the sky? How could a single explosion flatten millions of trees? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly exploded over Siberia that morning? For years, the answers remained hidden beneath the fallen forests of Tunguska. But when scientists finally reached the site, they discovered something even stranger. Something that transformed a natural disaster into one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. Because despite all the destruction, there was no crater. If an object powerful enough to flatten 80 million trees had struck the Earth, there should have been a crater, a massive crater. Yet no one could find one, and that was only the beginning of the mystery. In the days following the explosion, strange reports began arriving from across Europe and Asia. Thousands of miles from Siberia, people noticed something unusual in the night sky. The darkness never fully arrived. Cities that should have been covered in night remained illuminated by an eerie glow. Residents of London, Paris, Berlin, and other European cities reported bright twilight long after sunset. Some newspapers claimed that people could read outdoors at midnight without artificial light. Astronomers were equally puzzled. Observatories across Europe recorded unusual atmospheric conditions. The sky seemed brighter than normal. Strange, luminous clouds appeared at high altitudes. Scientists suspected that enormous quantities of dust had somehow entered the upper atmosphere. But from where? And how? The answers would not come quickly. At the time, Russia was facing major political and economic challenges. The empire stretched across 11 time zones, and the Tunguska region was among the most isolated places within it. Simply reaching the blast zone required an extraordinary effort. There were no roads leading to the area, no railways, no convenient transportation. Researchers would need to travel by train, riverboat, horseback, and on foot through some of the harshest terrain in Siberia. As a result, years passed without a proper scientific investigation. The mystery remained frozen in time. Then came a man determined to solve it. His name was Leonid Kulik, a Russian mineralogist fascinated by meteorites. Kulik believed the Tunguska event was caused by a large meteorite impact. If he could locate the impact site, he might discover valuable fragments from space. In the 1920s, nearly 2 decades after the explosion, he organized an expedition into the Siberian wilderness. The journey was brutal. The terrain was covered with swamps, rivers, dense forests, and endless stretches of wilderness. Travel was slow and exhausting, but eventually, Kulik and his team reached the region where the explosion had occurred. What they found shocked them. The forest looked as though a giant, invisible hand had swept across the land. Trees lay scattered across the landscape for mile after mile. Millions of trunks pointed away from a central location. From above, the pattern resembled the spokes of a bicycle wheel. Everything had been knocked outward from a single point. The force required to create such a pattern was immense. Yet the closer Kulik moved toward the center of the destruction, the stranger things became. He expected to find a giant crater. Instead, there was nothing. No impact scar, no massive hole in the ground, no obvious meteorite fragments. The evidence simply didn't fit. Then the expedition discovered another clue. Near the center of the blast zone, many trees were still standing. At first glance, this seemed impossible. If the explosion had been powerful enough to flatten millions of surrounding trees, why had these survived? A closer inspection revealed the answer. The standing trees had been stripped of branches. Their bark was scorched. Many were dead. They looked like giant wooden poles rising from the devastated landscape. The pattern suggested something remarkable. The force of the explosion had not originated on the ground. It had come from above. Instead of striking the earth directly, whatever caused the disaster appeared to have detonated in the atmosphere. This would explain why trees farther away were blown sideways, while some directly below the explosion remained standing. The blast wave had traveled downward and outward simultaneously. It was a revolutionary idea, but it created an even bigger problem. If the object exploded in midair, what exactly was it? And what could release an amount of energy powerful enough to devastate thousands of square kilometers without ever touching the ground? As scientists studied the evidence, theories began multiplying. Some believed a giant asteroid had exploded over Siberia. Others argued it must have been a comet. More exotic explanations soon followed. Ideas involving antimatter, miniature black holes, even alien spacecraft. The further researchers investigated Tunguska, the more mysterious it became. What should have been a straightforward impact event was turning into one of the greatest scientific puzzles of modern history. And over the decades that followed, scientists would propose some of the most extraordinary theories ever suggested to explain a natural disaster. By the middle of the 20th century, The Tunguska explosion had become one of science's greatest unsolved mysteries. Researchers agreed on one thing. Something enormous had exploded above Siberia in 1908. But beyond that, certainty quickly disappeared. Without a crater, without a large meteorite fragment, and without direct observations of the object itself, scientists were forced to piece together the event from scattered clues. And those clues seemed to point in different directions. The first and most widely accepted theory involved an asteroid. According to this idea, a rocky object from space entered Earth's atmosphere at tremendous speed. Traveling tens of thousands of miles per hour, it compressed the air in front of it. As pressure and temperature rapidly increased, the asteroid eventually broke apart. The resulting explosion released an extraordinary amount of energy high above the forest. At first glance, the theory seemed convincing. It explained the fireball seen by witnesses. It explained the shockwave. It explained why trees were flattened outward from a central point. And it explained why no crater existed. If the object exploded before reaching the ground, a crater would never form. Yet there was a problem. Scientists searched the region for decades and found surprisingly little meteorite material. Where was the debris? If a giant asteroid had exploded over Siberia, shouldn't fragments be scattered everywhere? This question led some researchers toward another possibility. Perhaps the object wasn't an asteroid at all. Perhaps it was a comet. Unlike asteroids, comets contain large amounts of ice mixed with dust and rock. A comet entering Earth's atmosphere could potentially vaporize almost completely. Most of its material would disappear during the explosion. This would explain why investigators struggled to find large fragments. The comet theory gained support throughout the 20th century. However, it too faced difficulties. Computer models suggested that certain observations didn't perfectly match what scientists would expect from an icy comet. The debate continued, and as the mystery grew, so did the imagination of those trying to solve it. Some theories became increasingly unconventional. One of the strangest involved antimatter. Antimatter is one of the most exotic substances known to physics. When matter and antimatter collide, both are converted into pure energy. Even a tiny amount can produce an enormous explosion. A few researchers suggested that an antimatter object from space may have entered Earth's atmosphere and annihilated itself above Siberia. The resulting blast could explain the immense energy release. But there was a major problem. Such an event should have produced other detectable effects that were never observed. Most physicists eventually dismissed the idea. Then came an even more extraordinary proposal: a miniature black hole. According to this theory, a tiny primordial black hole left over from the early universe passed through Earth. As it traveled through the atmosphere, it generated a massive release of energy before continuing into space. The concept sounded like science fiction, and for good reason. There was no convincing evidence supporting it. Yet the very fact that respected scientists were discussing black holes revealed how unusual the Tunguska mystery had become. Other explanations moved even further away from conventional science. Some people claimed the explosion was caused by an alien spacecraft. Supporters pointed to the lack of a crater and the unusual characteristics of the blast. According to these stories, an extraterrestrial vehicle either crashed or deliberately exploded above the forest. The theory captured public imagination and inspired books, documentaries, and countless conspiracy theories. But despite its popularity, no credible evidence has ever supported the idea. No technology, no wreckage, no proof. As exciting as the alien explanation sounded, it remained firmly in the realm of speculation. Meanwhile, scientists continued gathering data. New expeditions visited the region. Tree growth patterns were analyzed. Soil samples were collected. Chemical traces were examined. Researchers studied eyewitness reports and compared them with modern computer simulations. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The evidence increasingly pointed toward a natural cosmic object, rather than something exotic. Measurements suggested that the explosion released energy, equivalent to roughly 10 to 15 megatons of TNT. That is hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Yet all of that energy had been released in the atmosphere, not on the ground. Modern simulations showed that an incoming space object could indeed explode several kilometers above Earth's surface and create devastation, matching what investigators found in Tunguska. For the first time, scientists were beginning to understand how the event may have unfolded. But one final question remained. If researchers were finally closing in on the answer, what exactly happened during those final moments above Siberia? More than a century after the explosion, new evidence and advanced computer models would bring scientists closer than ever to solving the mystery. More than a century after the Tunguska explosion, scientists finally possessed something the witnesses of 1908 never had: powerful computers. Using modern simulations, researchers can recreate the final moments of objects entering Earth's atmosphere with remarkable accuracy. And the results tell a fascinating story. Today, most scientists believe the Tunguska event was caused by a large asteroid or a fragment of a comet entering Earth's atmosphere at incredible speed. The object was likely between 50 and 80 meters across. That may not sound particularly large. After all, many skyscrapers are taller. But size can be deceptive in space. Traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, even a relatively small object carries an unimaginable amount of kinetic energy. As the object plunged into Earth's atmosphere on the morning of June 30th, 1908, the air in front of it compressed violently. Temperatures soared. Pressure increased dramatically. The object began to break apart. Within seconds, the stress became too great. Then came the explosion, not on the ground, not at the surface, but several kilometers above the forests of Siberia. The blast released an estimated 10 to 15 megatons of energy. To understand that scale, consider this. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima released roughly 15 kilotons. The Tunguska explosion was hundreds of times more powerful. The atmosphere itself became the weapon. A massive fireball expanded outward. Superheated gases surged through the sky. An enormous shockwave raced toward the ground. When it reached the forest below, millions of trees were instantly overwhelmed. The blast flattened roughly 80 million trees across more than 2,000 square kilometers. Yet because the explosion occurred high above the surface, no large crater formed. The mystery that had puzzled scientists for generations suddenly made sense. The absence of a crater was not evidence against an impact. It was evidence that the object never reached the ground. For many researchers, the case was essentially solved. But the story of Tunguska does not end in 1908. In fact, its greatest significance may lie in what it teaches us about the future. The Earth is constantly bombarded by material from space. Most of it burns harmlessly in the atmosphere. Tiny particles arrive every day. Small meteors regularly produce bright streaks across the night sky. Occasionally, however, something much larger appears. A reminder of this danger arrived in 2013.